Hi, Angel Friends. This is Lindsay Feddick, the Angel Friend Trainer, and we are so blessed to have Jessie Tappel here today. She has been on the Gabriel Network board since 2016, and she's a licensed professional counselor. And she'll be talking to us about preventing compassion fatigue and how to best work with our clients. Take it away, Jessie.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm very excited to present to you today just some information about understanding and prevention compassion fatigue. For anyone who works in ministry or in any serving capacity, this is a really important topic to be aware of and to help especially develop some particular skills to preventing it so that you're able to serve and work more efficiently and more effectively with those around you. So today I'm going to run through some slides, and if there's some questions at the end, Lindsay is here to answer those as well as provide some additional information at the end. So I wanted to start off today by talking about what is compassion fatigue. It's a word that has been developed in the recent years of the study of traumatology because we have learned that the impact of trauma and the impact of difficult work has a significant effect on the worker itself. So Charles Figley is one of the, I'd say, like leading founders of this word and of his work as a clinical traumatologist. So I found this quote very helpful to start us off. We've not been directly exposed to the trauma scene, but we hear the story told with such intensity, or we hear similar stories so often, or we have the gift and curse of extreme empathy and we suffer. We feel the feelings of our clients, we experience their fears, we dream their dreams. Eventually, we lose a certain spark of optimism, humor, and hope. We tire, we aren't sick, but we aren't ourselves. And I think this is important, especially good to frame this, that we take on, and the ability to take on the stories is a real thing. So I want you throughout this presentation and throughout this webinar to reflect on once we go through this, what is compassion fatigue for you? Do you see it in others? Have you identified it in a team, at work, at home? Can you think of some ways that you see this in day-to-day life? So here are some of the definitions of compassion fatigue and burnout that we'll walk through today. Compassion fatigue is also called vicarious traumatization or secondary traumatization, and we'll go into those a little bit deeper later. So it's essentially the exposure to working with those suffering traumatic events can rub off. It can stay with you, it can linger with you. It's cumulative, so it builds on itself. Burnout is a cumulative process marked by emotional exhaustion and withdrawal associated with an intense workload, not trauma related. So that's really important. I think many of us can experience and identify, okay, this was a time in our lives when we experienced burnout at work or at home or whatnot, and we really needed a rest. So compassion fatigue differs in the sense that it is trauma induced. So it comes from working with those who have been traumatized. We also talk about primary traumatic stress. So those stressors that are inherent to the event, and such as like when you directly experienced or witnesses those trauma events, it can cause a traumatic response. So compassion fatigue. So I love this image of Mother Teresa. She was well known for the serving and understanding the role of the poor and in working with them, especially in India. She understood compassion fatigue, especially due to the intensity of her work. So she wrote in her plan actually that it was mandatory for the sisters that worked with her to take an entire year off of their duties every 4 to 5 years to allow them to heal from the effects of the work. So it just shows you that even, we're not meant to continue to work and work and work and work. Even if it's good things that we do, we need to be aware of the effect that it has on us. So recognizing, is this burnout or compassion fatigue? So some of the stages of burnout, Charles Figley talks about stagnation, so not being able to move, feeling like everything is dead. and enthusiasm. So actually I would say a lack of enthusiasm. So measuring how much enthusiasm do you have for your work and willingness there. Levels of frustration are part of the stage of burnout. And also apathy, just not really caring, not really having an interest or an engagement. So not only are caregivers vulnerable, but everyone around them is also vulnerable to experience burnout. And so it's really important just to be aware of all of those involved at all of the different levels to see how the person is affected by the work that they do. So here are some similarities of burnout and compassion fatigue. Emotional exhaustion, reduced sense of personal accomplishment or meaning in work, experiencing mental exhaustion, causing some isolation, so not wanting to interact with others or be with them. Depersonalization. So this is a symptom that we talk about in psychology, where it's a disconnection of yourself from the real event. So it's almost like you're not really experiencing what's in reality, but you're outside of yourself. And also physical exhaustion. So just being tired, losing sleep, not eating well, those are all symptoms of burnout and compassion fatigue. So also, compassion fatigue not only affects just yourself, but it can affect everything around you. So we talked a little bit about physical experiences, sleep disturbance. You might be more sensitive to what is happening around you. Things you could tolerate before you experience this might decrease. So you might be more reactive to something that normally you're okay with, but suddenly, oh my goodness, I just blew up about something that was before pretty neutral, but now it's really much more intense. Your ability to think through activities will decrease. Your judgment can be impaired and your behavior impaired. And you can just experience a general loss of morale. So all of these things obviously don't sound so good. So kind of working through them and understanding what's happening is really important. So if compassion fatigue is not treated or not identified, it can result in depression and or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which can then compound into a serious loss of self-worth, emotional dysregulation, so like an inability to control and regulate your emotions. Everything around you is going to be impacted. How you see yourself, how you see the world, how you interact with God and your spirituality, all of those are going to be impacted by the experience of compassion fatigue. So you can experience a loss of hope, a loss of meaning, despair, anger towards others. And so it can escalate. So this is a great also reflection. So when helping hurts, this is a great resource on taking care of yourself, especially in the service and ministry work. So first you should understand that it's a process. It's not a matter, this is the process of the development of compassion fatigue. It's not a matter of one day you're living your life with a great deal of energy and enjoyment, and the next you wake up exhausted and devoid of any energy, both physical and emotional. Compassion fatigue develops over time, taking weeks and sometimes years to surface. Basically, it's a low-level chronic clouding of caring and concern for others in your life. And whether you work in or outside the home, over time, your ability to feel and care for others becomes eroded through overuse of your skills of compassion. You also might experience an emotional blunting, whereby you react to situations differently than one would normally expect. So it's really important just to identify these symptoms because you might experience them and see them over time, and just recognizing, okay, these are a normal part of the development. Everyone, it's a normal thing to experience compassion fatigue at times, but it's what you do with it that really makes a difference. So I'm going to walk through just some examples pretty quickly about what we call stress injuries. So these are the ways in which we're affected by those things around us. So these are kind of the general categories of which we look to see basically what is happening, how has stress impacted us, what does this look like in terms of kind of those definitions. So the first one is acute stress. So this is the most common form of stress. So it comes from demands and pressures, short term. It isn't last long enough to do extensive damage, as in kind of long-term stress would. So mostly the common symptoms are emotional distress, which is some kind of combination of anger or irritability, anxiety, or depression. You might have muscular problems, tension headache, back pain, jaw pain. We actually hold a lot of stress in our bodies, so you're going to feel a lot of physical symptoms sometimes when you're in acute stage of acute stress. So this can crop up in anyone's life, but it's highly treatable and manageable. So if it's not treated, it can turn into what we call acute stress disorder. So this is a diagnosis come from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's kind of what most counselors and psychologists use to recognize and look at mental disorders. But it basically is characterized by having intense fear, helplessness, or horror to a traumatic experience. You might experience dissociative symptoms, which mean kind of a numbing and detachment, and like a dissociative amnesia. And you might experience reoccurring thoughts and memories, flashbacks, increased, anxiety, distress, those kinds of things. So it can be pretty significant and pretty invasive to your normal life. And so acute stress disorder, when those symptoms are present for more than 4 weeks, it becomes post-traumatic stress disorder. Now we've heard this diagnosis. Many are familiar with it, especially in the context of war and understanding the impact of very violent situations on our veterans and on kind of our first responders. And so those who have experienced PTSD will have significantly altered kind of sense of self and day-to-day experiences. So there's a various amount of symptoms that come with PTSD. So this is just pretty severe numbing or feeling like you don't care about anything, feeling detached. You can't remember the aspects of the trauma you experienced. You're unable to engage in normal activities like you were before the trauma. And you kind of avoid those triggers and those things that remind you and take you back to those places. It's pretty severe, and with most PTSD, it's recommended to seek treatment and to seek help, especially since it's become pretty serious and pretty ingrained in your memory. So working with a counselor or a psychologist is really necessary. I've seen this a lot with those who have experienced sexual trauma or kind of domestic violence. Those situations can also induce PTSD in terms of future relationships, future health, future hope, those kinds of things. So it can be present in many more situations than just the war zone, if you will. So we've touched on a little bit about what compassion fatigue is in relation to these things. And I feel kind of the big focus of compassion fatigue, the impact is really on relationship. So when you think about it, when you are working as a first responder or in ministry or with others that are in need of something, you're there to serve, you're there to give. And when your ability to give in that relationship is impacted, you can recognize that as a symptom of compassion fatigue. So your ability to connect both with those who you are serving and your family at home, your friends, your kids, your coworkers. If you find yourself like, I'm having trouble connecting with others, you might want to evaluate, okay, what am I experiencing? What am I associating that could be considered a fatigue of some kind? And how can I build on that in order to help me work through that? So it's very common, especially kind of in working in these scenarios, to experience secondary traumatic stress. So this is to describe when you don't directly experience the traumatic event, but you hear about it, such as experienced by someone else. So someone's telling you a story, they're recounting their history, they're sharing with you a very intense and deep personal experience, and it can be very traumatic to the person to whom it's being told. And so the negative effects are going to be the same for secondary traumatic stress. You might have intrusive imagery. You might have those memories pop up. You might want to avoid the person or the cue. You might feel distressed or be impaired in some ways. So it's important to recognize, okay, even just the fact of hearing and experience these stories, even though you weren't there to witness a traumatic event, it still is going to impact you. So vicarious trauma is another word for this, the same, and this is talked a lot about in terms of working with those who have been traumatized. And so what happens in vicarious trauma is the self, yourself, is transformed when working with these traumatized clients in their reports of things. So you'll find just a disruption of spirituality, of meaning, of hope. It can be applied to, I like their summary here of, it can be applied to a wide range of persons who assist trauma survivors, including clergy, frontline social service workers, justice system professionals, healthcare providers, humanitarian workers, journalists, hospice professionals, and first responders. So it's really important to recognize what you're exposed to, especially when you're in as a ministry worker as well. So we'll run through this really quickly. Burnout can result when individuals are exposed to trauma, fear or uncertainty, loss of economic security or position, and anger over diminished control or circumstances. And so this is just going to unfold gradually in response to the daily stress. Stress is unfortunately a common thing we have, and it's how you deal with it that makes all the difference. Avoiding stress is not really easy to do at times. It's sometimes a natural part of the work that we do, but it's how do we build ourselves up so that we can respond to it in a good, healthy manner. So managing the stress and burnout in organizations is really an important function in human resources, actually. So preventing burnout requires additional research and work, actually, to be able to engage in strategies as a team to help to facilitate a healthy coping mechanism with stress. So we have, like we've touched on before, progressive loss of idealism, energy, goals as a result of stress. And so this burnout can experience not just at work, but also at home. If you've been up too late with your kids too many times, or there's been a lot of loss or grief lately, or a difficult time, or a particular struggle that you're having, you can feel like high levels of stress can really cause over time burnout. So sometimes it's been called, the burnout has certain characteristics that can be described as exhaustion mixed with anxiety and depression. And so stress that has an intensity, duration, and persistence produces burnout. So it's very important to find ways to break up those periods of stress in your life so that you're able to recover and to recoup and to really refresh those ways in which you can continue to heal from the stress. So we use the term resilience to talk about how is our adaptation to our environment? How are we resilient? How do we bounce back? How do we recoup? So this is actually a survival skill of humans and of animals as well. So for humans, it comes in a lot more intellectual way, is how we talk about ourselves. How do we understand the problem? They use the term survivor versus victim. So saying I'm a victim of sexual abuse is very different than saying I'm a survivor of sexual abuse. So understanding those, even though the language change, shows a different sense of resilience, an ability to bounce back or work through those various abuses and traumas that they've experienced. And so knowing how, and studying and understanding how resilient are you to stress? How are you able to cope with the demands of life? So we talk about this a lot in terms of the context of how do you take care of those who aren't able to take care of themselves, and what to do in response of these major disasters such as like earthquakes and floods and fires and all of these horrible human things that all you need to do is open up the news, right, to see, okay, there's a lot of really intense chaos going on in our world. How resilient are the people that are experiencing it? And they might need help in building that resiliency and working towards like a greater health or healthier healing from a lot of what they've experienced. So the idea is post-traumatic growth. This is a term that says, okay, you've experienced a trauma, and how do you work through it towards the hope and the healing and positive change for the future? And so this is kind of the study, and the research has really gotten more deep into this idea and that concept of here are the areas of growth that they look for after trauma. Improvements in interpersonal relationships, a greater appreciation for life, new opportunities or pathways in life, a greater sense of personal strength, an ability to cope with crises, and spiritual changes or development. So we look to want to measure and really help people invest in these areas in their life, especially where they are after they've experienced a horrific event, and to help them actually come up with a plan to flourish and grow through it so that you can, one, understand the trauma and work through that, but also realize the impact doesn't define you. You're able to grow and to flourish into something greater. So I want to run through quickly a couple other readiness factors in terms of when we're talking about how to prepare for wellness. These are just 3 typologies of what we kind of talk about. How ready are you for change, and what do you do and how do you react when you are in these situations? So the first type of reluctance of being able to engage in these factors is called the worker bee mentality. So as we go through here, sometimes it's helpful to think, okay, does this resonate with me or with my dynamic at work or at home, and just to see kind of where you fit in with this. So the first type of reluctance to change comes from the helper not understanding and appreciating the long-term negative consequences of poor self-care. So these are, I don't take care of myself. I'm going to go. I'm going to work on performing and productivity, and I'm not going to recognize the wear and tear that it's having on me. So it believes that the organization is good and wise and responds well to options of self-care, but they need a little help in understanding the impact of what the long-term has on their own self. The second type is the change phobic. So this is where I don't know if I change something, is something else going to happen that I'm not going to enjoy. So these are unknown consequences provoked by those things around us. So the helper frequently fears admitting to problems that can be corrected by proper self-care. So they have trouble identifying, okay, even if I change this, will anything be better? So not wanting to be weak or ineffective. I want it to be right. I want it to be the right thing, but I'm not quite sure if this change is actually going to have an impact. So helping these helpers understand that there's some irrational fear of change at times. The commitment to change is the first step, and the self-care plan will be tailored to fit whatever particular situation they're experiencing. The third type is the untrusting. So this, unfortunately, comes from a basic lack of trust in the organization, coworkers, other helpers. Yet effective changes in wellness requires trust. Trust is really the foundation because you believe and you trust, okay, something good is going to come out of this development into this investment. So you have to then recognize, what am I not trusting in this organization? That's the first step in developing a plan for change. So an important question to ask this type of helper is, what is necessary for you to decrease your reluctance to change and to be more committed to self-care? So as we talk about kind of the predispositions to change and working in those self-care plans, we also want to look at how do you deal with stress? How do you cope with stress? Stress, like I said, is a normal experience of human nature, but how do you end up coping with it? So the 4 different types of personalities, if you will, of how do you cope with stress? The first one, a hero personality. So this is a passive avoidant coping style. They don't know exactly what support they need because they haven't thought about it much, because they are just go with, like, I'm just going to plow through. It doesn't matter. I'm going to do exactly what it takes, and I'm not going to think about the impact that it has on me. The John Wayne personality is more of an active avoidant coping style. So they don't really know what they need, but but they deny it is needed and will not accept it if offered. So they use fine as the answer to everything. How are you doing? Fine. Like, I'm good. I don't need anything. I'm good. I don't want anything to change. So it's a very kind of avoidant of what is going on, but they're very active about talking about it. The third coping personality is a victim personality. So this is a passive support seeking coping style. So they want attention to themselves without directly asking for support. So kind of wearing suffering like a uniform. So think of Eeyore, okay, from Winnie the Pooh. It's kind of like, oh, it's always rainy. It's always cloudy. There's not a lot there. And so it's really hard to get them to move, right? Because it's very passive and it's very like, please come help me. I'm so overburdened and overwhelmed. I don't really know what to do. And finally, the customer personality. So this is an active support seeking coping style. Admit they need help at times. They're proud of their efforts at coping and they take responsibility for their stuckness. So they often know what they need to get unstuck and explicitly seek out support until it is required. So they're very active in wanting to make changes to identify those areas in which they need support. So we want to be customers. So customers are realistic. So if they feel overwhelmed by some activities, yours and your family, they will learn to say no. This is a big question of boundaries, right? We could have a whole nother webinar on boundaries, but learning to say no and saying yes to that which is important in their life. So customers eliminate activities that are not absolutely necessary. You might be taking on more responsibility than you could or should handle. If you meet resistance, and usually resistance comes in the form of when you set a boundary, those around you might be resistant to it. You have to give reasons why you are making those changes, why you're setting those boundaries. And you must be willing to listen to other suggestions and be ready to compromise. So customers believe that no one is perfect, so don't expect perfection from yourself or others. But here are the questions that you need to ask as a customer. What really needs to be done? How much can I do? Is the deadline realistic? What adjustments can I make? Don't hesitate to ask for help if you need it. So I think these are great questions to exercise boundaries, to understand what impact stress is having, what control do I have over these activities in my life, and really seek to make changes to those as well as a customer. So we're going to move into a little talk about self-care. Self-care is an interesting topic. I feel like it's pretty trendy nowadays of, oh, it's, facials and, quiet time, and I'm just going to unplug from the world and watch TV, and that's all I'm going to do for self-care. Self-care is truly, how do you take care of yourself as a human being in order to then continue to relate as you are called to in your role as a family, at work, with your friends, and those relationships are really important. So it's much more than just taking 10 minutes to do kind of the personal things, but to go a little bit deeper and to understand, what do I need? What are my needs as a human being in my relationships, and how am I taking care of myself throughout that? So first, you have to recognize, don't do any harm to yourself when you are working, when helping and treating others. So you want to be very attuned to, what are your limits in work? What can you say yes to, and what do you have to say no to? And this will vary with every person based on their own history and experience. And secondly, for self-care, you need to attend to all of these areas. So physical, social, emotional, spiritual. You can add like psychological in there as well, to know, okay, these are the different aspects of what make me human. Therefore, I need to be able to relate to them in a different way. Committing to self-care. So it's a commitment. We need to commit, like anything. Does anything happen unless you plan it, unless you work at it, unless you sit and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. We've got to make a plan. So it needs to be written, public, specific, measurable. I like to say, I don't know if you've heard of SMART goals, but they're SMART is an acronym for specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. And so making goals that can fit those things, self-care fits into that too. We can't have the pie in the sky ideal of next year I'm just going to be a better person. It doesn't work like that. It has to be specific. So you need to set deadlines and goals. So these should be connected to specific activities of self-care. And we're going to work through, you're going to have some resources in order to work through some of these ideas. Then you're going to generate strategies that work and follow them. So this plan must be attainable. It needs to be realistic to where you are right now in the present moment. So some strategies for letting go of work. So same things that go along here. Along with your personal goals, work can be that way too. So how do you let go of work? How do you set deadlines and goals specific to your work activities? And exactly that. Find some SMART goals. Work with your manager, with your boss in order to help attain and to make these practical. So to gain a sense of self-care achievement, so to feel like, okay, I'm successful at this, you need rest and relaxation. Rest is a very important part of self-care. We live in a very, very busy culture that is often go, go, go. And it's quite difficult actually to find silence, to find rest, to find those areas of peace in our lives. But that needs to be a priority in order to really reflect on self-care. And so look at how do you effectively reduce the stress on a day-to-day basis. And it'll change depending on, do you have kids? Are you single? Do you have activities? Are you involved in groups and clubs? What is your work schedule like? It's going to be tailored, it needs to be tailored to each individual person so that it's effective in managing your stress. So here's a quick little inventory of different areas of self-care that can be helpful, things to think about as we're walking through. So the first is physical. We can't forget our physical being. We are our bodies, and we're more than a body, but the body is a very important tool that we use obviously day to day. So we need to understand what tension are we holding? Where do I feel stress in my body? It's going to show up somewhere. How am I sleeping? Am I getting the recommended amount of sleep? Am I getting proper nutrition? Am I drinking enough water? You'd be surprised at how much just even changing your water intake can actually help your stress level and reduce and be able to cope in a better way. So psychological, what thoughts are you having? What are those internal belief systems that are at play? Because sometimes not understanding what is that daily dialogue, that positive, negative self-talk can be a big impact, can have a big impact on self-care. So understanding when do you find those times to actually tap into those areas? Are you taking care of yourself on a psychological level? And part of this plan of self-care is to examine those different areas. We all need relationships. We are meant for relationships, and that's where we truly flourish. So we need to have social supports. We need to have positive interpersonal interactions. So we need to know those people who we can call upon when we need it, who know us well, who are able to connect with our needs and kind of really speak to truth many times. So also within that, like activism. So how do you prevent and work with those who don't have that, or to provide and to serve for those as you do kind of with the Gabriel Network as well. So continuing kind of the idea of an inventory. So these are some good areas just to reflect on. What is your balance between work and home? What are your boundaries like? Where do you need to set limits? How do you deal with the different roles? Everyone has a different role, and we'll have multiple roles. You could be both mom and friend and coworker and colleague and sister, and the list goes on and on. How do you deal with those roles, both socially and professionally? How are you getting support? Who's your support network? Do you consult with others on your team when you have a difficult situation? Do you have your own place to go back to process what has happened? Whether that's a spiritual director, a professional counselor, a good friend that's there to meet up for coffee, a mentor that can help guide and really influence kind of the work and where you're leading to. So these are kind of great areas to reflect and to look at. So developing your plan. So these are kind of the basic steps of how do you develop a self-care plan. So one, you got to start with where you are. Review your current self-care and prevention. So what are you doing now? What's happening? Do you have anything in place? Do you need to start to develop that? So what we went through, so select one goal from each of those categories when we talked emotional, physical, mental, spiritual. Look at how are you going to achieve that goal? What are those resources there to help me with that? Then you need to identify a support person. So talk about this with someone, get a buy-in with someone else, get an accountability partner. That really helps actually to maintain the stability and long-term implementation of this plan. And then you start, activate it, get started. It's never not a good time to start a new goal, but you want to make sure it's realistic and not too overburdensome, but start somewhere. Even a small step is a good step. Then you want to build in also, when do you check in on this? Weekly, monthly, yearly, with that support person. And even with yourself, start there. So on a weekly basis, can you schedule that in? Can you say, okay, how did I do on self-care this week? What did I do to take care of that so that I can take care of others? And then look at the changes. Notice what changes you see, because that's also very affirming and good support, just encouragement for yourself in this plan development. So we don't have time to run through all of these today, but here are some also ideas of things to integrate into your self-care plan. Sometimes when stress is very burdensome and overwhelming, it's really necessary to do some active stress management techniques. You can find a lot of these online and kind of help to work through some of these ways. You can do these at your desk. Everyone can do deep breathing. Everyone can do some mindfulness practices, a body scan. So you recognize, start at your head and work through to understand what tension you're holding. There's a technique called emotional freedom technique, which uses tapping on your skin just to activate kind of those senses and to help bring a mindfulness to the present moment, to exercise that as well. So those are just some ideas of things that you can also use to manage your stress on a daily basis. So I am going to run through these super quick because this is going to be part of your homework after the webinar. Who gets homework after webinars, right? So there's 4 different scales that Charles Figley, that I mentioned, he has done a lot of work in traumatology that help to identify where am I in terms of stress, how vulnerable am I to stress, what resiliency, we talked about resilience, how am I resilient, and how do I take care of myself? So these are all things for you to take, and it is really awesome at the prevention level of where am I in terms of my own stress, and how do I look at these scales to then inform me to develop my plan. So you will have those as well to run through and do on your own. And so this is the part where you get to start on your own worksheet, your own self-care prevention plan, prevention of compassion fatigue and other areas of your life. The purpose is to really flourish and to really make and enact a plan that's sustainable, but also will help you be more effective with those that you serve. And so these are just some great resources of which I used for this presentation that are also really great self-care resources. So Trauma Stewardship, an everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others. If you're interested in the practice of mindfulness, this book by Greg Bottaro is really excellent. A great self-care book by Julia Hogan, It's Okay to Start With You. Her book actually comes with a lot of little worksheets in it, which is really helpful. And if you're interested more in the impact of trauma, this is one of my favorite books of all time. It's called The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. So take a look at those if you're interested in reading more about the different areas of which trauma and mindfulness can actually help inform and prevent compassion fatigue and burnout. So that is it for the webinar, and I'm going to ask Lindsay if we have any questions immediately. And if not, we will continue on.
No questions on my end. I think that was so perfect for Angel Friends because, like you said, they have multiple roles, right? Yeah. This is their volunteer position that they are working in this ministry and they're doing such powerful, important work, but they're also moms and dads and friends and workers. So sure. It's really important to, take the time each week, each month to reflect on what we're saying yes to and what we're able to say no to, so we can better say a more full yes to those things that we are called to say yes to.
Absolutely.
And for our Angel Friends, if you do have any specific questions about your worksheets, about any of the material through this webinar, you can email me and I will either help answer it if it's a specific Angel Friend question, or if there's a more direct question for Jessie, I can help accommodate those questions as well. So if you ever need to reach me, my email is lindsay.fedick@gabrielnetwork.org, and it will be in this email that you've gotten, so you can just directly reply to me. But thank you so much, Jessie.
Thank you so much.